Now, when we spoke on the phone a couple of weeks ago, you said to me that the Cold War was really a hot war. And so explain to me what that means.
Well, what I meant by that was that during the 7 years I was secretary, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, we were facing the threat of Soviet movement against the West in some fashion that we might have to respond to with military action. And I'll give you an illustration. In September of 1961, a few months after President Kennedy had been inaugurated, the Soviets tried to take West Berlin away from NATO. At the end of World War II, Berlin, which was in the East German bloc, which was controlled by the Soviets, had been split in two parts, East and West. The eastern part was under the control of the Soviets. The western part was under control of NATO. And in September or October of 61, the Soviets sought to take West Berlin and incorporate it in the Soviet sector. We couldn't possibly accept that. And therefore, I won't go into the details, but therefore we responded, trying to avoid military action, but very quickly having to add to our supply convoys that were crossing East Germany a military escort. And then the Soviets instructed the East Germans to prevent a militarily escorted NATO convoy from crossing East Germany that we had a right to cross to supply West Berlin from doing so. And at that point, I called General Norstad, who was the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, to Washington and said, look, Larry, they did A, we did B, they did C, we did D. How's this going to evolve? He said, well, they'll do E, we'll do F, they'll do G. And I said, what do you do then? He said, well, I guess we'll have to use nuclear weapons. Now, that was September 1961. That's not Cold War, that's close to hot war. And we had a constant feeling of pressure from the Warsaw Pact and the Soviets during the entire 7 years I was secretary.
Could you have envisioned a scenario where we would have initiated the use of nuclear weapons?
The stated NATO policy and the stated U.S. policy with respect to nuclear weapons was we would initiate their use in the event of some conventional military force action by the Soviets or Warsaw Pact against the West. That would have been disaster, but that was the stated public policy. I stated we would conform to NATO policy. The presidents did, but I went to President Kennedy after I'd had time to begin to learn something about nuclear war or the risk of nuclear war, the dangers of nuclear war, and I said to the president, Mr. President, this is the U.S. stated policy, this is the stated NATO policy. Never, never, never follow that. There's no way after roughly 1960, certainly after 61, there's no way the U.S. could initiate a strike against, a nuclear strike against the Soviet Union without stimulating the Soviets to respond with a strike that would bring unacceptable damage on the U.S. And what do I mean unacceptable damage? Well, probably the killing of millions, destruction of communications. As the time went by, it got worse and worse and worse. But even early in the administration, initiation by the U.S. of a strike against the Soviets, given the fact that we had huge advantage in terms of numbers. At the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, as I remember, I thought we had a 17-to-1 numerical advantage. But at that point, and that was October 62, I did not believe, under any circumstances, we should initiate a nuclear strike against the Soviets. Because even 5 or 10 nuclear weapons targeted on the east coast of the U.S. would destroy millions, tens of millions. What U.S. president or secretary would ever have acted in a way that would yield that result? So the stated nuclear policy of the U.S. and NATO at that time was wrong, and it's wrong today. That's still our policy, by the way, stated policy.
Could you have envisioned a scenario whereby the Soviets would have initiated a nuclear strike?
Well, of course we envisioned it, and our objective was to deter it, and we thought we had. One of the reasons we had as many weapons as we did, many times what they had was, in the first place, we didn't have exact knowledge on what they would build for the next 5 years, our lead time, so we had to guess how many they'd have 5 or 7 years from now at the end of the time, our lead time for purchasing. And we almost always overestimated the number they've had. But in addition, we wanted to be sure that they saw that if they ever intended to strike first, we would inflict unacceptable damage on them. And the result of that was that we had several times as many nuclear weapons as they had from, say, the mid-'60s into the mid-'80s.
But now, growing up
Stop you real quick. We're just gonna put some.
country, we were sort of raised with this fear that this was imminent, this could really happen. From your standpoint, how real was the Soviet
Well,
threat?
the best evidence of how real it was the action during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviets moved missiles, and they were planning to move warheads. We thought they'd already moved warheads into Cuba, with the missiles to be targeted on the east coast of the U.S., putting 90 million Americans at risk. And they did that because they thought it would be in their advantage. It's not entirely clear which of several reasons was the primary reason, whether it was to deter us from invading Cuba and overthrowing Castro, or whether it was to increase the strength of their nuclear forces, which were in lesser numbers than ours across the world, or whether they had some other reason. But whatever the reason was, we felt, for good reason, that we had to move those, force them to move those missiles and warheads out of Cuba. We tried to do it by diplomacy, then we couldn't do it that way. Then we tried to do it by imposing what was called a quarantine. It was in effect a blockade. We used the word quarantine instead of blockade because blockade is a word of art connoting military action. We didn't want it thought of that way. But in any event, we put up the quarantine. At the end of several days of the quarantine, they still weren't moving to move those missiles out. And therefore on Saturday, October 27, 1962, the president spent all day with his group he called the Executive Committee, the senior military and civilian security experts, debating what to do. And at 4:30 in the afternoon, the Joint Chiefs recommended unanimously that we prepare, that we invade, attack Cuba within about 2 days, 2 to 3 days. We had planned an invasion force if that were necessary. The reason the chiefs recommended it at 4:30 in the afternoon on Saturday was that we all agreed we couldn't attack, couldn't invade Cuba after those missiles became operational. And the CIA thought they'd be operational within 2 to 3 days. And therefore, if we were to attack, we had to do it before then. At the time, the CIA thought the warheads for the missiles had not been delivered. They thought the first batch of 20 coming on a ship, I think it was called the Poltava, that would arrive in a couple of days. So the chiefs believed if we're going to have to attack, we should do it within 2 to 3 days. It wasn't until 29 years later, in a meeting in Havana, Cuba, chaired by Castro, that a Russian general named Gribkov, who at the time he retired was the highest-ranking Soviet general in the world, he was commander-in-chief of the Warsaw Pact, it wasn't until January 1992 that he told us that at that moment, 4:30 in the afternoon, Saturday, October 1962, they had about 160 nuclear warheads on the soil of Cuba, roughly 60 tactical weapons to be used against an invasion, and roughly 90 to be used by the missiles targeted on East Coast. And we came that close. It's very, very dangerous.
That's great. You need to cough?
Yeah,
Let's
sorry.
do it, please.
All right.
You okay?
Good.
If you would, somewhat of a brief description of the policy of nuclear deterrence, just.
Well, in the late 50s and the early 60s, the Soviets built up a very large conventional military force, that is to say, a military force without nuclear weapons, in Europe. they had been putting political pressure and other pressures on the West, and the presumption was that at some point they might use that large conventional military force to attack Western Europe. And the U.S. forces that were stationed there to help protect Western Europe. And therefore, the U.S. had adopted a policy under the Eisenhower administration of deterrence. Some call it a big bang for a buck, meaning that NATO believed, rightly or wrongly, that it could not develop a conventional force sufficiently strong to deter the initiation of a conventional military attack by the Soviets against NATO. And the only way that attack could be prevented, the attack by a Soviet conventional force, would be for NATO to acquire nuclear weapons using the U.S. forces to confront a Warsaw Pact conventional attack with a nuclear response. That was NATO's stated policy at the time. And it was done in order to lead the Soviets to conclude they should never initiate a conventional attack. That's what was called the deterrent policy. The deterrent policy involved confronting a Warsaw Pact conventional attack with a nuclear response that would be so great as to inflict unacceptable damage on the Warsaw Pact and therefore lead them to conclude ahead of time they should never initiate.
How dangerous a time was this really?
It was very, very dangerous. As I mentioned, in October 61, Larry Norstad, the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, envisaged that we might have to initiate the use of nuclear weapons. In October 62, a year later, we came within a hair's breadth of utilizing nuclear weapons in connection with the Cuban Missile Crisis. In June of 67, at the time of the 7-day war or 6-day war, in which Egypt was intending to try to literally wipe Israel off the map, we were involved, and that was the first time the hotline had ever been used. The hotline was installed after the missile crisis. There was an exchange of messages between Kosygin and Johnson. One of the messages from Kosygin to Johnson said, in effect, if you want war, you'll get war. Now, I mention all this, and all that time, by the way, the Vietnam conflict was underway, in which the Soviets had joined with the Communist Chinese to support North Vietnam in their attempt to take over South Vietnam and presumably extend their hegemony across East Asia and South Asia. So we felt, as I say, that the Cold War was a hot war, that the West was under intense pressure from Communist China and Communist Soviet Union.
Now, Dr. Strangelove, which was made in 1963, the scenario that it explores is the notion that somehow one of our bombers got loose and was headed for Moscow with nuclear weapons and could not be recalled. So my question is, based on what you knew, could an accident like that have ever happened?
Well, I don't want to say whether an accident like that could happen, although I will comment on that in a moment. But accidents could happen, there's no question about that, whether it's with bombers or with missiles. We subsequently, subsequent to my entering the government, we introduced what are called permissive action links into our missiles and bombs. And these are to prevent, I think we still have them, these are to prevent anyone from arming the weapon without, I'll call it, presidential authorization. And that required that we introduce into the warhead a device that prevented arming until there was introduced into that device the code numbers that, in effect, permitted the arming. And the code, that's why the president, after that permissive action link decision was made, and today, still has what's called the football. If you observed President Bush being inaugurated shortly after he took the oath of office, a blue-suited officer stepped behind him, and that was an Air Force officer carrying the code. And the president must be accompanied by that code 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That gives him, and in effect only him, the capability of arming the warhead and launching it.
You said before accidents could happen. Would you comment on that? What did
Well,
might happen?
there are various kinds of accidents that could happen. Misunderstanding of commands, misjudgment, miscalculations about dangers, misreading of information that a Soviet attack was underway. We had many false radar readings and other readings of Soviet attacks caused by a host of phenomenon, physical and other phenomenon. So there was always that danger that what we thought was a Soviet attack, which we would wish to respond to before it landed. The Soviet missiles took roughly 30 minutes to fly from Soviet Union to the U.S., and we believed we would have warning after about 15 minutes of flight, and therefore we would have 15 minutes to launch. And today, we have something on the order of 6,000 strategic warheads, of which roughly 2,000 are deployed on ready to launch on 15 minutes. And you may have a misreading of what's happening, and that's one of the greatest dangers.
Now, if something like that had happened in the 60s, how do you feel we would have responded? How do you think they would have responded?
Well, if as in the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis, if we'd actually launched an attack on the missiles and the warheads that we thought were in Cuba, they almost surely would have responded with nuclear weapons. We had prohibited, President Kennedy and I had prohibited our invasion force that we had planned to use if necessary, which would have been a huge attack. The first day's airstrike was planned at 1,080 sorties, and we had 180,000 troops mobilized in southeast U.S. ports with the necessary shipping to take them to Cuba. The first day's air attack at 1,080 sorties would have been larger than any single day's air attack in the Kosovo War, as an illustration. And they would have almost surely responded with nuclear weapons. And we would have had to respond. Even though we prohibited the invasion force from carrying them, it's inconceivable that the president and the secretary would permit a U.S. force to be attacked with nuclear weapons without responding. We would have used aircraft based in the southeast U.S. Fields that could deliver nuclear weapons against Cuba. And how would they have responded? Who knows? Almost surely they would have used their nuclear weapons against our invasion force. And as I say, we would have responded with nuclear weapons. And very likely they would have used some of their strategic weapons, either from Cuba and or the Soviet Union, against the continental U.S. with devastating results to us. We would have destroyed them. They would have seriously injured us.
So in effect, an accident could conceivably have created an escalation?
Well, in the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis, events were out of control in those last few days. Accidents did happen. We had to send a U-2 over to gain reconnaissance information on whether the Soviet missiles were becoming operational. We believed that if the U-2 were shot down, the Cubans didn't have capability to shoot it down. The Soviets did. We believed if it were shot down, it would be shot down by a Soviet surface-to-air missile unit, and that it would represent a decision by the Soviets to escalate the conflict. And therefore, before we sent the U-2 out, we agreed if it were shot down, we wouldn't meet. We'd simply attack. It was shot down on Friday before that critical Saturday, October 27th, 1962. Fortunately, we changed our mind. We thought, well, there might have been an accident. We won't attack. Later, we learned Khrushchev reasoned just as we did. we sent over the U-2. If it were shot down, he reasoned we would believe it was an intentional escalation, and therefore he issued orders to Pliev, the Soviet commander in Cuba, to instruct all of his batteries not to shoot down the U-2. And Khrushchev, I believe in his biography, said the U-2 was not shot down by Russian forces because he issued orders to the contrary, but by Cubans. The Cubans had no capability for it. I mention this only to say, at that critical moment, events were slipping out of control on both sides. Oh, one other illustration of the point. At this critical moment, when the U-2 was flying over Cuba, we learned that a U-2 on a weather mission, sampling weather at high altitudes, over Alaska, had strayed across the Soviet border and was over Siberia and might well have been interpreted by the Soviets as part of a basis for an attack on them. So this is typical. You cannot control military operations as closely as you can conventional operations. And hence, the lesson of the Cuban Missile Crisis is that human beings are fallible. We all know that. Conventional wisdom is don't make the same mistake twice. Well, maybe you make it 3 times or 4 times, but not 5 or 6. You learn. There's a learning period. There isn't going to be any learning period with nuclear weapons. You make one mistake, you're going to destroy missions. And therefore, the lesson of the Cuban Missile Crisis is the indefinite combination of nuclear weapons and human fallibility will destroy nations. We've got to get rid of nuclear weapons.
That's great. 10 minutes short. You got 2 minutes left. Okay.
I think we're about out of time. I mean,
Oh, we're getting. But what's your
but how many minutes?
How many minutes are we?
I have 7 minutes of tape left.
How many?
7 minutes left.
Oh. So, no, how many minutes have we used?
23.
No, we're only going to do 25.
Yeah, but you're so interesting.
No, 2 more minutes.
Okay. Let's then talk 2 quick things. In the movie, the character of Dr. Strangelove talks about a theory of acceptable losses if they attack, if we attack. What's your feeling about that?
Well, I can't conceive of acceptable losses in connection with a nuclear attack. These weapons were large weapons. We know that a very small nuclear weapon, 15 kilotons, at Hiroshima killed, as I remember it, 80,000, 85,000, something like that. These weapons, on average, were at least 20 times that in terms of destructive power. I can't conceive of any president or secretary of defense being willing to accept 100,000 or 500,000 U.S. dead in connection with any military initiative that he could avoid.
That's great. What is the nuclear landscape today? Do we live in as dangerous a time now as we did in the 60s?
I think we live in a very dangerous time now because the Non-Proliferation Agreement, Non-Proliferation Treaty, which prevented the proliferation that President Kennedy feared lay ahead, has been very successful. But now it's falling apart. North Korea has withdrawn from it. Iran seems to be moving toward a nuclear capability. It's inconceivable to me that we can deal with the North Korean problem, North Korea being almost certainly building nuclear weapons today. It's inconceivable to me we can deal with that with a military action. We must engage in diplomacy. We don't have any effective diplomatic negotiations underway. Very, very dangerous, both North Korea and Iran. If either one or both of them move ahead with nuclear weapons, others are bound to. Japan, Taiwan, the Middle East, and so on. It's an extremely dangerous world.